Good evening, everybody. We're going to be discussing the parable of the 10 virgins tonight. So I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 25. The first 13 verses is what we're going to be looking at, as you can see from your screen there. We are in the middle of a discussion, a long quarter on the parables of Jesus. We've looked at all these parables kind of in order. We've looked at them probably in order of the most well-known, probably to the least well-known. And the parable of the 10 virgins isn't necessarily unknown from a lot of people. But I would argue that it is in a lot of ways unstudied. And so what we want to do tonight with our study in the parables of Jesus is really kind of look at this parable, peel back the layers like we've been doing with the rest of these parables, and see what Jesus is really getting towards. Jesus always, as we've discussed this quarter, always has one major point that he's driving towards. And not in this case, not only is it just in this parable, it's really in these two chapters in Matthew 24 and 25. But that's the case kind of with this one too. He has one major point that he's driving towards, but there's a lot of these little sub-points. And I think there's a lot of things that we can make, a lot of applications that we can make about this parable that I think are really, really powerful. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the parable of the 10 virgins. Last week, we looked at the story of the unmerciful servant, how powerful that story was, how impactful that story was, talking about interpersonal relationships. And Matthew chapter 25 comes at the more of the climax of Jesus's more public ministry. This is near the end of his time, at least on earth, right before his arrest and his crucifixion, his resurrection. And so this represents the last kind of discourse that you would have, although this one is largely private. Jesus' conversation, as far as we can tell in Matthew chapters 24 and 25, which make up the context of this parable, is mostly relegated to just his apostles, his immediate disciples that ask him a series of questions. And so Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, the story of the 10 virgins, needs to be seen within that context. And so, like we do with every class we've had this quarter, and like I think we should do anytime we look at it, have a textual study, we need to really look at the context to see the environment of what Jesus is talking about, see the points that he's trying to make as he builds up to that. That, I think, is the key to really understanding a lot of these parables. Before we go any further, though, and we've done this every quarter, although we always haven't had people comment like we should, I would really encourage you to comment tonight. I want you to ask yourself the question, what is this parable really about? You know, as we look at the parable of the 10 virgins, there are a lot of people that have a lot of things to say about it. There are people that say it's about preparation. There are a lot of people that say it's about obedience. There are people that say it's about keeping an eye out for your Savior and always kind of keeping a state of readiness. I think all of those things kind of are in play here, but I want to ask you the question, what is this parable really truly about? Put it in the comments, make sure other people can see it, interact with each other if you want to, but let's get a dialogue going of how we can actually, of other people's opinions and other people's viewpoints on what this parable is about. Before we go any further, though, I do want to go into the context. That's, to me, the most important part when you discuss any kind of parable or a textual study at large. You have to understand the parable or the point of this context. And to me, the context is seen very simply in Matthew chapter 24. I want you to look at these first three verses of Matthew chapter 24, because this forms the home base for the rest of this parable. Matthew chapter 24, starting in verses 1 through 3, it says that Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Now, I want to stop right there real quick, because it's important not only to see where they're at now, but where they were originally. And if you back up to Matthew chapter 21, chapter 22, chapter 23, there's a lot of things that's happening in these chapters leading up to it. Chapter 21 is, I think, where Jesus has this triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He has officially made his presence in Jerusalem. He's been relegated mostly in his ministry to Galilee. That's where he spent most of his time. Has come down to Jerusalem once when he was a child. I think he came down another time when he was adult. But most of his activity has been in Galilee. So Matthew chapter 21, he enters into Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 22, you have this long back and forth with Jesus and the Herodians, Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus and the Sadducees. He answers three questions, and he asks his own question. And so there's kind of this back and forth where he's jockeying for position. People are challenging him on different things, and Jesus shuts all of them down really, really quick. But that tension you can see is there in Matthew 21, really picks up in chapter 22. Matthew 23, Jesus almost goes completely, I don't want to say unhinged, because that's a very negative term, but he doesn't hold anything back by any stretch of the imagination. Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 1, he speaks to the crowds and the disciples, and then proceeds to spend 10 verses describing the various sins that the scribes and the Pharisees have. And then starting in verse 13, going down to the end of the chapter, there's long woes that he has. There's 8 woes that he gives towards these people. And then in verse 36, I'm sorry, in verse 34, he talks about the persecution that's going to be coming down through verse 36. And then in verse 37, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left you desolate. Verse 39, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Verse 39 to me is a great transition point to go into chapters 24 and 25, because that phrase heralds the arrival of the Ancient One, as you can see from the book of Daniel, but it heralds the arrival of the Messiah, the arrival of Jesus. And I think when you look at chapters 24 and 25, especially 25, think about Jesus' second coming, you kind of see the logical fulfillment of that. But in verses 37 and 38, Jesus is emphatic that these people are essentially left to their own destruction. They've rejected God time after time after time for a period of hundreds of years. Jesus is now showing up and speaking to them. They've rejected him. There's nothing left to do to these people. There's nothing left to do for these people. And so in verses 37 and 38, he says, your house has left you desolate. The destruction that's going to take place, the blood is on your own hands. That's the point that he makes in verses 34 through 36. There's nothing else I can do. Leaving out of Jerusalem, or at least leaving out of the temple there in chapter 24 and verse 1, his disciples point out the various temple buildings to him. Now, Jesus doesn't need a tour guide in this situation because he is the eternal one. He was there whenever they built the temple, whenever Solomon built the temple and the foundations were laid. He doesn't need instructions on what the temple was, what it was, and what it looked like. In verse 2, though, Jesus uses this opportunity as a teaching point. And so in verse 2, he says, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. The idea of the destruction of the temple is not a new one, because in 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar sweeps in, takes all the nobles, all the youths out of Jerusalem. 596, the second invasion. 586, the third invasion. 586 is when Jerusalem is completely annihilated. And it sits vacant like that for a period of 70 plus years. Until Zerubbabel comes back, then Ezra and Nehemiah come back. Within about 200 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is mostly rebuilt. There's still some things obviously left to do. But for the Jews in this time period, and especially for the disciples, that would have been a very bizarre type of statement, because especially the temple as it is now, at least in this time period, is not so much of a religious center, although it certainly is that. It's a political and cultural center. The temple, as it has known in the time of Jesus, extends from that simple, Holy of Holies, the holy place, the courtyard, extends out from that to have a huge kind of perimeter. You have big courtyards, you have a bunch of other shops and things that people are doing. That's why when Peter speaks in Pentecost Acts 2, there's probably thousands of people that are listening to him at that one moment in time. So it's a huge kind of cultural center, but it's also a position of pride for Herod. Herod is trying to please the Jews right before Jesus is born. So he builds the temple, he expands the temple. That's why it's called Herod's temple. It's a point of pride. And the destruction of that would almost represent the destabilization of the entire region of Judea. The apostles know that. The Romans know that the Jews are very unstable. So the last thing that they're going to do is destroy the temple unless it comes to that. Of course, we know it's going to eventually. AD 70, the Great Judean War, the Judean-Roman revolt that starts around AD 66, AD 67, ends with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Everything is annihilated. Everything is destroyed. And Jesus is referencing, in part, that event here. In verse 2, he says, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. He's talking about the literal destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, which at that point seemed not unheard of because of what had happened in the past, but very unlikely, because that represents a full-blown tension between Judea and Rome that just isn't really existing at this point. There is tension, but not to the point where they're going to annihilate the temple. They'll be there very quickly, though, within 40 years. In verse 3, after Jesus makes these claims here in verse 2, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. It says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The Mount of Olives, if you remember, is Jesus's kind of home base away from Jerusalem. This is where he's at right before he's arrested. He's not necessarily in the Garden of Gethsemane. He would be there when he is arrested, but he retreats to the Mount of Olives several times during this last week of Jesus' life. So this is kind of his home base outside of Jerusalem. And the apostles ask three questions. They say, actually, it could be two questions depending on how you look at it. They say, tell us, what will these things happen? That's question one. What will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of your age? You can look at that as two questions. You can look at that as three questions. But regardless, they have questions for Jesus. And Jesus, rather than kind of dismissing, answers all three of these questions, both of these questions, in the next two chapters. Chapters 24 and 25 are these long conversations where Jesus describes the destruction of Jerusalem, where he describes the end of time when the Messiah will eventually come back to annihilate the world. And there's a lot of carryover to that. And that's one thing we need to remember about these two chapters, is they can be kind of confusing because it seems like we don't really know which one he's talking about. When he describes the destruction of Jerusalem coming rapidly, coming out of nowhere, coming as a surprise, you can say the exact same thing about the end of time and the twinkling of an eye, as a thief in the night, these types of things. So there's a lot of carryover between the destruction of Jerusalem and also the annihilation of the world when Jesus comes back during the second coming. There's a lot of similarities between that. Keep in mind, though, look down at verse 36. This is really where the transition points come, where the transition point happens. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36, it seems like Jesus kind of makes a transition right here. Because if you look in verses 32 through 35, for instance, he says, now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Verse 34 signifies that what he's talked about up until that point is going to happen within a lot of these disciples' lifetime, or these apostles' lifetimes. So this generation will not pass away until these things take place. When you look at what he says leading up to that, the bulk of this argument that he makes in verses 3 down through verse 35 is about not being rattled when you hear and see things that signify the end of the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I can't think of a more applicable scenario, at least loosely based, in our world right now. Because when you look, for instance, at verse 23, he says, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. What Jesus understands is there are going to be people that will arise, that will show great signs, that will show great wonders, and people will be drawn to them because they believe that this is the second coming of the Messiah. They believe that this is the person that's going to lead them, or that's going to take them, back to the Messiah, or something like that. They think that this person is going to be sent from God. And what he says here in verse 24 is, this person's even going to mislead the elect. There's going to be a lot of false signs, a lot of false wonders, but you cannot listen to them. Don't be rattled by it. If you look in verse 26, behold, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Or if they tell you, behold, he's in the rooms, don't believe him. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, even will the coming of the Son of Man be. It will be a surprise. It will be momentous. It will be instant. It will be something that doesn't have a whole lot of heralds. Unlike what you see with Jesus' arrival in this time period, John the Baptist preaching for years before Jesus shows up on the scene, there's not going to be a herald. There's not going to be some warning sign that you can get ready for it. And keep that point in mind, because that's the exact point that Jesus is going to make when he discusses the parable of the 10 virgins. That there's not going to be some huge sign. There's not going to be some big moment. You just need to be ready for it. He talks about, in this section, tribulation. He talks about wars. He talks about rumors of wars. He says all these things are going to happen, but you can't let that lead you astray. So that's the context leading up to verses 32 down to verse 35. Verse 36 represents a little bit of a shift, because he says, for of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one will be left. The point of this, in verses 40 through 41, the point of this section And these two verses have been used by premillennialists, postmillennialists, rapture people to argue that it's going to be sudden, that it's going to be, out of nowhere. And that point is true. But if you ever watch, for instance, the Left Behind series, if you ever read the Left Behind books, they describe this type of situation where, two people are flying on a plane and all of a sudden you look to the left and there's just clothes that are now where a person used to be. Or, you're walking down the streets or you're driving down the road and all of a sudden the driver is gone. That's not really what he's talking about here. The point of saying these two things in verses 40 and 41, especially when you look at the context, is to describe the fact that life is going on as normal. There's no herald, there's no, prophecy, there's no, trumpet, there's none of this stuff that foretells Jesus' arrival. Now, Jesus' arrival will be marked by a great noise, trumpet, that type of stuff. Excuse me. But there's nothing that prophesies, beforehand to tell you to get ready. You just need to be ready. When Jesus comes, life will be continuing on as normal as we see it in today's world. That's what 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about. Comes in the blink of an eye as a thief in the night. Life goes on. That's his point, especially there in verse 38 down to verse 39. But look at this. He makes this point in verse 42 through 44 that I think is worth pointing out. He says in verses 42 through 43, he says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not allow his house to be broken into." That's a very understandable statement. If I know what time a thief is planning to break into my house, I'll certainly call the cops so that they can be ready. But at the very least, I'll make sure my family is away. I'll make sure the doors are locked. I'll make sure the security system is alarmed. I'll be ready for it. The fact of Jesus' return being unknown, or the time period being unknown, forces us to exist in that state of readiness all the time. And that's an important point, because if you're preparing, let's say you knew for whatever reason you were going to die 6 months from now. These next 6 months would be spent with you getting your life in order, going to worship services, being obedient, being baptized if you haven't been. You would be spending those 6 months getting ready for that moment. Now, if you knew that you were going to die 10 years from now, you may spend 9.5 years doing whatever you want to, and then the last 6 months getting ready for it. That's not what God wants. What God wants is people living for him all the time, living for him and watching for him and looking for him all the time, instead of doing what they want to do and then just kind of making, these kind of emergency plans at the end. So that's what verses 42 through 44 are all about. You must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. I want you to look at verses 45 through 51 now. 45 through 51. He says, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes." In other words, the slave operates every single day faithfully in his master's house because he doesn't know when his master is coming back. So every single day he operates as the way he should. Verse 47, "Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' begins to beat his fellow slaves, eat and drink with drunkards." In other words, do whatever he wants to, act like he's the owner of the house, which, by the way, I think is a direct slam on the Jews here. The Jews are not the immediate audience, as you can see from the first 3 verses. I think this is a direct slam on the Jews here, where they think they run the place. They can beat their fellow slaves, eat and drink with drunkards, because the master's gone, it's their house, at least in their own eyes. If that happens, verse 50, "The master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know. He will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." I've always thought it was really interesting in verse 51 that Jesus chooses to use the word hypocrites. He doesn't say assign him a place with the tax collectors, the sinners, the harlots. He would use those types of phrases in other places. For instance, last week, the parable of the unforgiving servant. If your brother doesn't, listen to the church after the 3rd admonition, he's to be to you as a Gentile and as tax collector. He doesn't say that here. Verse 51, he says, assign him a place with the hypocrites. And the reason for that is because this is a person who is acting one way when certain people are around, and then when those people are gone, he acts a completely different way. God does not want duplicitous disciples. I just made that up on the spot, but I really, really love that alliteration. He doesn't like duplicitous disciples. He wants people who are genuine. He wants people that are going to be faithful to him no matter what. That leads into the context of the parable of the 10 bridegrooms, or the 10 virgins here in Matthew 25th chapter, about people who are ready for God, people who are always ready no matter what the time comes. That's the context leading into Matthew chapter 25 and the first 13 verses. So I want you to look at this parable. Now, as we've mentioned before, the context of this parable applies, in my opinion, specifically towards the end time, or I'm sorry, the return of Jesus, when Jesus comes back. But I think it could really apply to either. These disciples and these people that are listening to these parables, that would hear these parables later, need to understand that the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen. And they need to be ready for that destruction of Jerusalem at any point. That means living according to God's will, but also being ready to flee when they see the signs coming. When Jerusalem was overtaken in AD 70, the Romans showed up and trapped everybody inside. But those who knew what was going to happen, those who listened to Jesus' words here, they ran to the hills and they were saved. But once the Romans put a siege around the city, there was no escape. And you can read some of Josephus's writings if you want to, just to see how terrible a situation this was for all these people. When you look at Matthew chapter 25, though, we'll read the first 13 verses here in just a second. What he's really getting at in these first 13 verses is, once again, the principle of being ready. But he also makes a point that these are people, that this is what the kingdom is going to be like at the time of Jesus' second coming. Now, as we read earlier, there's a reason we read, verses 37 down through verse 41. This coming of the Son of Man will just be like the days of Noah. 2 women will be grinding in the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. The state of the kingdom at Jesus' second coming will be exactly the way that the kingdom is now. It's everybody living their normal life, everybody going about their daily activities. It's going to come at a moment, as he says here in verses 45 through 51, it's going to come at a moment when we least expect it. And so it's not going to be, 6 months of tribulation. It's not going to be 1,000 years of trial. Jesus is going to come, and then there's going to be the judgment. And that's, I think, what the scriptures teach very clear. I wanted you to read Matthew chapter 25, though. Look in these first 13 verses, and let's examine this parable. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 1, he says, "The kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom." Now, there are people that try to make a lot of, the 10 virgins, the 10 number. You can argue that it issues a state of completeness. I think you can look at biblical numerology and see that. I think it's also just a very logical explanation for the way weddings were conducted in this time period. Weddings in the first century AD were very unique. They don't have them the way that we have now. They don't operate the same way. You have an engagement, which is a formal agreement by the fathers that these two people are going to be married. And then you have a betrothal process. And that's where it usually lasts 6 months, I think, up to a year, where two people are promised to one another. That was the situation with Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus. Joseph and Mary were betrothed, but they hadn't actually been married yet. And that was what Joseph's concern was. How can this woman be pregnant, considering that we're not yet married? Has she been with another man, something like that? But there's that betrothal process that can last upwards of a year. And then you have the marriage. And that marriage scene is what's happening here. It's a scene of great anticipation. People are ready for it. But it's also a huge deal. A marriage feast in this time period could last upwards of a week. So, these marriages, when you think about, for instance, Jesus' first miracle when he turned the water into wine, that was a long celebration. These marriages are a lot different than what we have in today's world, but the same principle still applies. So look back at Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 1. They took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy, began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the prudent answered, "No, there will not be enough for us and you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with them to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the virgins also came, saying, "Lord, Lord, open up for us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Be on the alert, for you do not know the day nor the hour." There have been people that have been upset that Jesus kind of uses women in this context as being unready. I think people that do that make a huge mistake, because when you look, for instance, at verses 14, right after that, this parable of the talents, he uses men. Right before that, he uses men. So the parable applies both to men and women. And I think you can see a little bit of that in verse 2 when he says, five are foolish, five are prudent. This is a common issue. This is not something that's relegated to any one kind of gender. So I just want to say that out before we go any further. But I think when you read this parable, the first 13 verses of Matthew chapter 25, it's so powerful, but it's also so heartbreaking. Because when you think about, especially when it says here in verse 11, Lord, Lord, open up for us, to me, it sounds very similar to Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for a pot of stew. Esau bitterly regretted that, especially as Hebrews 12 points out. He sought for it diligently with tears. When you think about, as we read a few weeks ago, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man desperately wanting some kind of reconciliation, some kind of comfort in his pain. There's something that happens, in this moment where when you realize the reality of your situation, you realize that your torment is eternal. The only thing that you want in your life is just a little bit of mercy. And so this dichotomy is very apparent here. And we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead of ourselves, but stay with me. The dichotomy is very apparent here. You have people, these bridegrooms, you can make the same argument about us. There's obviously the principle, the teaching of this parable. But you have these bridegrooms who are asleep. The last thing on their mind and their concern is, what's going to happen when the bridegroom shows up. They're asleep. They don't care. They didn't think ahead. But when the bridegroom or when the groom shows up and that door is shut, the only thing, the most important thing for those people in that moment is a little bit of mercy, for that door to be open. And they had ample opportunity in the hours, the days, the weeks, the months, years leading up to that. But those first 15 seconds after that door is closed, after you pass away, everything that's important in life becomes crystal clear. And I guarantee you, the rich man that's in torment, Esau, would give anything to go back to that moment, go back to before death, go back to before he sold the birthright, to just have that moment where he can make a different decision. That's the powerful part of this parable. It's the tragic part of this. This parable is incredibly tragic because you don't have really any separation between these people prior to this moment. You don't have, Jesus saying here in verse 2, 5 were wicked and 5 were righteous. He doesn't say that 5 were obedient, 5 were disobedient. He says 5 were foolish and 5 were prudent. There is virtually no separation of these people until the moment of the preparation takes place, where they decide they're not going to take extra oil. That's the only thing that separates them. And what we need to realize about that is that salvation is very definite. It's very serious. It's not as if, when we stand before God in judgment, it's not as if we can talk our way out of things. It's not like we can make up all the excuses for why this didn't happen, because the moment of mercy has been passed. Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago, and it's our responsibility to get our life right with him now. That's what we need to keep in mind about this. Now, you could see also another little kind of mini parallel when he says here in verse 11, Lord, Lord, open up for us. Jesus in the parable or in the Sermon on the Mount would say much the exact same type of thing. When he would say, many will come up to me in that day saying, Lord, did we not sacrifice many things in your name? Did we not do great wonders in your name? Lord, Lord, do we not know you? And he says, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. There's this pleading that takes place that happens on behalf of the bridegrooms, that happens on behalf of these people where they desperately want to enter into that feast, and they don't let them. Now, some people would say that this was rude of them. And I think there are lots of people that say, well, why didn't these 5 foolish share with the 5, or 5 wise, why didn't they share with the 5 foolish? If that's your argument, you can see right here why they didn't, because in verse 9, no, there will not be enough for us, and you too go instead of the dealers and buy from yourselves. If the 5 wise shared their oil with the 5 foolish, then there would not have been enough to go around. And so instead of all 10 of them failing, the 5 that prepared are going to enter into the feast that they've prepared for. Now, when you think about that in a modern day application, the same principle applies. When we stand before God once again on Judgment Day, as we just mentioned, we are going to stand before God by ourselves. We're not going to stand there in tandem with the church, in tandem with our family, in tandem with the elders, with our friends. We're not going to stand there in tandem with them. We will stand alone. And I cannot rely on somebody else to share their righteousness or their obedience or their salvation with me. It's impossible. but any more than I can share my my salvation, my obedience, my righteousness with somebody else. It doesn't transfer that way. I stand before God alone. We can't share our obedience, we can't share our salvation with everybody else. So when they say here in verse 9, there's not going to be enough for us and you too, he's not saying that they don't want to. Because I think when you look, for instance, at Paul's writings in Romans 10, he says very simply, I wish that I were lost and everybody were saved. If we could share our salvation with other people, I would love to do that. Everybody would love to do that. But that's not how it works. That's not how salvation works. We have to, as Paul would say in the book of Philippians, work out our own salvation with fear and with trembling. We need to stand before God confident in what we have done in our life to be pleasing towards God and to have that salvation. That's the point of this. Now, I want to ask you this question too. This is a thought question for us all. What separated the wise from the foolish? You know, we've said several times so far tonight in this parable that the problem was preparation. That's exactly what separated them. If you look, for instance, in verses 2 and 3, or verses 2, 3, and 4, that's the point, is what separated them was their preparation. Verse 2, 5 of them were foolish, 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. For the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. So keep that in mind. In verse 3, the foolish take their lamps and they took no oil with them. The reason for that can be very simple. Maybe they think that he's coming early. Maybe they think that he'll be on time. They didn't realize, according to verse 5, that he was going to delay. And because they weren't ready for any kind of, different scenario, because they weren't prepared for, what happened with the bridegroom, which the bridegroom may have delayed for a variety of good reasons. Because they weren't prepared for that contingency, they were unprepared for the feast to take place. I'm reminded of when Saul looks out amongst the Philistines and he's waiting for Samuel to show up to offer the sacrifice before he goes out to battle. And Saul, the 7 days pass, Samuel still hasn't showed up. And Saul says he forces himself there in 1 Samuel, he forces himself to offer that sacrifice. Essentially what he does is he panics. He never thinks to himself about any contingencies. What if Samuel's late? What if we don't have the people? What if Samuel doesn't show up? What if Samuel takes another week? He wasn't prepared for contingencies. And because he wasn't prepared for contingencies, he takes matters into his own hands. These people, verses 2 and 3, were not prepared for any contingencies. And I think in some ways, when you look at, especially concerning Jesus' statements here are primarily to the apostles, I think in large part he's talking about persecution. We need to be ready for the fact that our salvation may not come when we expect it. All of us who have gone through tough times in our life, all of us who are sitting in times of real trial, and I think a lot of us are in that right now with COVID, we're looking at the situation saying, when is God coming? When is Jesus going to return to take me home? When is that moment going to come? And if we don't have enough oil to last through these storms, then our faith is going to be extinguished. We need to make sure that when we prepare for our salvation, prepare for our life with Christ, we prepare for the long haul. There was no indication, at least that we can see in this passage, that the bridegroom was going to be delayed. And yet the 5 wise realized that there was a possibility and took extras along with them, just in case something happened. When we prepare our faith, when we root our faith, we need to root it deep. We need to root our faith strong in preparations and in faith for God through any circumstance. If this happens, if this happens, if this happens, ask yourself, as great as we have it in this country, and I know there's a lot of things that are happening that are negative, but as great as we have it in this country, what would happen if the United States fell? What would happen if the United States was overtaken by some other country? Everything would be upside down. Would your faith still be intact? Would my faith still be intact? If your family, according to what happened to Job, if your family is gone all of a sudden for whatever reason, what's going to happen to your faith? What's going to happen to my faith? Our faith needs to have contingencies. We need to prepare and root our faith deep enough that we can be prepared for whatever the situation is. That's the difference between these two people. One of them prepared for contingencies, the other one didn't. But I want to point out something else about this passage. People have really gotten mad at these bridegrooms, at least as mad as you can get about people in a story. But people have gotten mad at these bridegrooms, according to verse 5, because they're sleeping. The fact that they were asleep is not the problem. As a matter of fact, I think the sleeping adds to the nature of what we read from Matthew 24 about how the coming of the Son of Man is going to be the same as in the coming of the days of Noah. Life is normal. The problem is not that they slept. The problem was that when they were awakened, they weren't ready for it. Instead of sleeping, they should have gone and made preparations. You know, if he's delayed in coming, which is what, by the way, it says in verse 5, he was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. If you know he's not going to be coming, instead of drifting off to sleep, use that moment and go prepare. He's not here now, taking a little bit of time, go prepare then. The problem was not that they were asleep. The problem was that they were sleeping when they should have been preparing. 5 prepared, 5 didn't. And I think what that shows you, especially from the fact that all of them brought their torches, all of them were prepared for it, is that a lot of the people that are going to be the 5 foolish virgins look very similar to the people that are 5 wise. The only differentiation between these 10 was in that moment of delaying, in that moment when something changed, when the formula changed. That's what was the defining factor between the two. All of them had torches, all of them had at least a measure of oil to initially, all of them were asleep. The differentiating factor between them was when the bridegroom came, that revealed everything. And there are Christians, like we talked about, I think a couple weeks ago with the parable of the wheat and the tares, there are Christians that sit right next to us on the pews. There may be Christians that are talking to you right now over the screen, but we can all be victim to this. There are Christians right now who are living their life very unprepared, or who possibly living a duplicitous life. People who are living a life according to, whatever they want to do. But when the moment of persecution happens, when the moment of decision happens, that's when the difference between the wise and the foolish will take place. When the bridegroom comes and he separates those, as he talks about later in this chapter, and he separates those two, then you'll know who is truly prepared and who wasn't prepared. The only question for us that we have is, am I being prepared? Or am I preparing myself for that inevitability? You know what? All of us, I think, would be very happy if we've been faithful towards God. All of us, to a certain extent, would be happy to see Jesus come now. This world is tough. This world is hard. And if I know that I can go and be with Jesus for all eternity, why would I not want that? As a matter of fact, you see that at the book of Revelation. One of the most powerful statements in that book is when John cries out the end, the Lord is coming quickly. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. Christians want to be with God. We want that to happen. But if he delays in coming, let's say he doesn't show up for another 1,000 years. Let's say he allows this world to stand for 5,000 more years. Will my faith be able to carry me through this storm, through this time period? Have I prepared my faith for the long haul? And in that moment when Jesus comes, will I have enough oil in my lamp to greet him? Will I be there ready to greet him and looking forward to greeting him? That's our parable for tonight. I know we probably went a little bit longer than we normally do, but I appreciate you sticking with me. That's a powerful parable. It, probably more than any other parable, has one main huge point. But I think when you look at this, especially Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus isn't really hitting a whole lot of points. He's hitting one point, and he's hitting it really, really hard. So I hope that point has been driven home for us as we study. Keep the comments coming. Keep the questions coming if you want to. Next week, what we're going to discuss is the parable of the shrewd manager. That's in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 12. It's a parable, in my opinion, that is vastly overlooked by just about everybody in the world, including myself. But it's a parable, I think, that speaks to a lot of the same principles we're talking about now, about preparation, about getting yourself ready for the future. So we're going to look at that next week. I appreciate your interest and your attention tonight. Thank you, everybody.